hello, and thank you very much, Professor Sandel, for joining us in today's chat for the Filbo, for the Feria Internacional del Libro de Bogotá. We're going to be discussing your latest book on the tyranny of meritocracy. And my reading of that book, at least, is that, you know, it makes two broad claims. First, that it is not true that we, and in the book, we is essentially the US, but of course, that is true of many societies, and I hope to talk about Colombia a bit today, since we are in this event. Don't really have a true meritocracy. We follow sort of the moral and the public values of meritocracy without actual meritocracy, and that's a big problem. But second, even if we had true meritocracy, that is, even if it were true that every person, you know, armed with their talents and efforts alone could get ahead, that would not lead to a desirable society. Right, to a good society. So that implies that we need to improve the quality of opportunity, but that this is only as a remedy, since the cult of meritocracy to some extent creates this additional erosion of public values and collective values and the common good. So if it's okay with you, I brought some sort of questions and topics for us to talk about each of these dimensions, and in each case trying to connect to Colombia and to other similar countries. And then if we have time, maybe we can speculate on broader implications on your book beyond meritocracy and perhaps also relevant, especially to countries like Colombia. So
it sounds like a very good plan, Leopoldo. In fact, you've given a beautiful short summary of the themes of the book. And so thank you so much for joining me for this conversation.
No, thanks to you. Okay, so let's see how far we can get into this ambitious plan. So first of all, on us not living in a true meritocracy. So would you kind of develop that a bit, and in particular, what the implications of that are? And I will follow up with a couple of questions that I thought of while reading your book.
Yes, of course. First, since the book is about the tyranny of merit, I should recognize that there is something paradoxical about criticizing merit as a tyranny, because for most practical purposes, merit is a good thing. If I need surgery, I want a well-qualified surgeon to perform it. And if the alternative to a meritocracy is cronyism and nepotism or aristocratic privilege, well then, of course, meritocracy looks like a liberating alternative. So how can merit become a kind of tyranny? Well, you just suggested, Leopoldo, two criticisms of meritocracy that I make in the book. One of them is that we don't live up to the meritocratic principles we profess. In a perfectly meritocratic society, there would be perfect social mobility one generation to the next. The class of one's birth would have nothing to do with one's ultimate social and economic status. We know that isn't true. In fact, in many societies, including in the United States, despite the American dream, most people who are born poor stay poor as adults. It's actually quite difficult in the US today to rise from rags to riches. Only about 8–9% manage to do that. If we look at universities, in a perfectly meritocratic society, young people from different social backgrounds and economic classes would be equally represented in universities. We know this isn't true. In the Ivy League and prestigious universities in the United States, for example, there are more students from the top 1% of families than there are from the entire bottom half of the country combined. So these are two indicators, but we sense it looking around us, that we don't live in a truly meritocratic society. affluent, privileged parents have figured out pretty well how to pass their advantages onto their children, how to enable their kids to compete effectively for admission to top universities. And I should ask you what the situation is in Colombia. But these are some indicators of the extent to which we fall short of realizing the meritocratic principles we profess. Would you like to speak about that before we turn to your second question, Leopoldo?
Oh, yes, of course. No, absolutely. I mean, if this is true in the US, and maybe it is less true in some other developed market economy nations that have, a stronger welfare states and more redistribution, but it is more true in places like Latin America, and in particular Colombia, where there is high and very persistent inequality, despite some progresses in some dimensions. And so I think that what you described, failing to live up to a meritocracy, is in places like Colombia, it is really, really just an ideal. It's not a reality that we live up in a society where your destiny is not shaped by the circumstances of your birth. Actually, it is very much shaped by the circumstances of your birth. And actually, maybe I can connect that to another reaction that I had, and then let you elaborate on your following point, which is, it's not only that these things that actually are not of your own doing, are just luck, play a very, very strong role in your destiny. It is also that luck in society is very path dependent. It's very cumulative. I mean, once you've had a big break, I see it in academia very clearly. If you have a big break, which could be a matter of your effort partly, but also largely a matter of luck, then you start, having more big breaks. So a big break can be a first very good job or a first very good publication in terms of academics. And I guess the same in many other dimensions of life.
Yes.
So I think that makes this particularly troubling. So my response is yes, with the extra kind of concern that these lucky aspects just tend to accumulate over each other, right?
Very much so. Luck builds upon itself. And this actually leads to the second question you asked, Leopoldo. Even if we could somehow achieve perfectly fair equality of opportunity, would a perfectly meritocratic society be a just society? Would it be a good society? Would it be a place we'd want to live? And in my book, I say, no, actually, it wouldn't, for the following reason. And we see this developing already in our quasi-meritocratic societies. Let's step back for a moment. In recent decades, it's clear the divide between winners and losers has been deepening, poisoning our politics, setting us apart. This has partly to do with growing inequality in recent decades, but it has also to do with changing attitudes towards success that have accompanied the rising inequality. Those who've landed on top have come to believe that their success is their own doing, and that they therefore deserve all the rewards that a market society heaps upon them. And by implication, they've come to believe that those who struggle, those who've been left behind, must deserve their fate as well. I call this the meritocratic hubris of elites, the tendency of the successful to inhale too deeply of their success, to forget the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way, to forget their indebtedness to those who made their achievements possible. Family, parents, teachers, community, the country in which they live. And so it's this forgetfulness among the successful and the hubris that leads elites very often to look down on those who struggle, that create, beyond the economic inequality, that create a kind of polarization in our societies that creates this gap between winners and losers. And it's this galling gap between winners and losers that would persist even if the meritocracy were perfected, because then the winners would have all the more reason to take pride in their own winnings, believing that those winnings were their own doing. And the kind of divides we're seeing today between winners and losers, so-called, have led, I think, to the populist backlash against well-credentialed meritocratic elites. And this has had a big impact in politics. I think it has a lot to do with the election of Trump in the United States, with the vote for Brexit in Britain, with the rise of authoritarian, hyper-nationalist, populist figures in countries around the world. So creating a society of winners and losers, this is a tendency of even a perfect meritocracy. And so this, in a way, is the more fundamental argument of principle that we need to reconsider. The idea that if only we could achieve a perfect meritocracy, then all would be well.
That's really interesting. And actually, since you wanted me to draw connections with Colombia, as I was reading your book, I thought of this recent experiment that you may be aware of, done by Albertazzi, Laun, and Mengel from University of Essex. They essentially put many of the ideas that are in your book to test by providing people with a location in the distribution of income. So some of them were shown a distribution of income in which they would show up as relatively rich. Some were shown a distribution of income in which they would show up as relatively poor. And then they asked them how much they believed in meritocracy, how much they believed that what they had was the result of their own effort and talent, or how much it was the result of luck. Well, it turns out that people who are just experimentally, so we can make sure that this is not because they have different values, beliefs, efforts in their life, but just experimentally exposed to one or the other kind of setting, people who did better, people who got ahead just because they were shown that they were relatively rich, believed that luck played a less important role and that all was the result of their effort. And the poor believed the opposite, that it must have been bad luck. And not only that, the poor tended to express less sort of trust towards institutions, connecting to what you just said about this kind of disenchantment with democratic institutions and the populist backlash. And that made me think about recent wave of protests in Colombia, in which one of the mottos in the streets was the following: que el privilegio no te nuble la empatía, which would translate something like, don't let privilege cloud empathy. And I think that's exactly something that might happen with this, belief in meritocracy. So that I say just this in the way of like connecting what you are saying and the populist backlash in the US to some, disillusionment with institutions in Latin America. This is true in Colombia, but it's something very similar that you would find in places like Chile and other places in Latin America. I think that really connects nicely. Yeah.
Yes, I find this fascinating, Leopoldo. Don't let privilege cloud empathy as a slogan. It's a very revealing slogan because it touches on just this feature of meritocratic hubris. If recognizing, well, put it this way, believing that my success is my own doing makes it hard for me to picture myself in other people's shoes. On the other hand, appreciating the role of luck in life can prompt a certain humility, can prompt the sentiment, as I look upon those who struggle there, but for the accident of birth or the grace of God or the mystery of fate, go I. That could be me. And so the kind of privilege that most clouds empathy is meritocratic privilege. Because meritocratic privilege, unlike feudal inherited privilege, where nobody could really say, it's my doing that I was born into this aristocratic family. But it is quite easy for people to say, it's my own doing that I scored well on these college entrance exams and that I did well in school and that I made a lot of money or had a successful career as a professional. So it's meritocratic privilege above all, more than traditional aristocratic privilege, that clouds empathy and a sense of obligation to the wider society, which is why I think ultimately there is a tension between meritocracy and the common good, and it has to do with these attitudes, Leopoldo.
Absolutely. And I think that also is important when it comes to solutions, because if you feel this way, you would be opposed to some of the obvious solutions that imply contributing to the common good in the way of taxation and other ways that maybe we can talk about solutions later on in the talk. But for the moment, I wanted to share with you a thought to see if you think whether it's too provocative or actually lines in with your ideas, which is you have this very interesting discussion of free will and predestination in the book, and how it ended being related to meritocracy in ways that perhaps it wasn't intended to. And perhaps you can elaborate on that, but the idea that I want to suggest is that as I was reading this, it made me think of how the set of beliefs around meritocracy have become almost like a religion, in the sense that it's a set of beliefs that are not based on facts. It's a whole system with its own ethic, right. And it's turned out to be divisive, as unfortunately many religions have been divisive. So do you think this is a stretch, or do you care to elaborate on that? I think that's one thought that if you have any reactions, I'd be happy to, I'd be interested in knowing.
I don't think it's a stretch at all, Leopoldo. I think there is something like a kind of religious faith, even religious fervor, in those who proclaim meritocracy and meritocratic privilege as the basis of deserving the benefits that the market bestows. And in fact, in the book, I trace the early history of the meritocratic idea, the meritocratic impulse. And it has its origin in debates, religious debates, theological debates about salvation. The early Christian philosophers and theologians debated the question, is salvation something that we earn through good works and faithful observance during our life, something we merit? Or is salvation entirely undeserved, an act of pure grace, the grace of God? And this was a lively theological debate through the history of Christianity. And early theologians, including Augustine, said, merit has nothing to do with salvation. It's a matter of God's grace. And then gradually, people fell into the view that good works and faithful observance would actually help one's chances to be saved, that there was some merit involved. And then the Protestant Reformation came along. Martin Luther said, this is a kind of corruption to believe that our salvation is in our hands, is our doing, is a matter of our merit, because that denies the gift of grace. And then you mentioned the doctrine, the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. The Puritan work ethic, it started out with this resolute commitment to the idea that salvation is a gift of grace. But once the work ethic got going, work for the greater glory of God, it became hard to believe, to hold on to the belief that worldly success, which reflected faithful work, had nothing to do with one's chances to achieve salvation. And so the meritocratic idea kept coming back. And the idea of gift, the idea of grace, kept losing out, never finally, never ultimately. It still figures in our culture, in our moral understandings, but it's now a minor voice, because the idea that our fate is in our hands, now shifting to a secular society and a market society, is deeply powerful and influential and tempting, because it seems to be the expression of human freedom and agency. My destiny is in my hands. I can make it if I try. Whatever I achieve is my own doing. But this older tradition recalls and draws us back to the idea that our notions of merit need to be tempered by the appreciation of luck or grace or fortune or indebtedness.
Yeah, that's a very interesting phenomena, but it's also hard to resist, right? It's very hard not to do that leap from thinking this way and believing that what you have is really your own doing, which I guess I was planning to talk about solutions later on, but since we are in this topic, maybe we can talk about it right now as part of a plea to recognize everyone's work, no matter what that work is. You suggest that we should think of taxation, and in particular, we should shift taxation from labor to financial and productive activities like high-speed trading or capital gains and stuff like that. I would agree on this, perhaps only adding that to minimize the costs that in the end all society would pay if this is too taxing of economic activity, one perhaps should have a minimal international coordination for this. And second, perhaps emphasize those taxes, that are both just, but also relatively less inefficient, like direct taxation of high incomes, taxations of inheritance, taxations of wealth. But what really I found most interesting about this was your discussion of how this is not only to improve, conditions to do better jobs and provide an opportunity to everyone, even if they don't have a college education, but also because of the messages that taxation convey, right? That taxation transmits social values. And I think this is super interesting, and it aligns with much of what I found and that you mentioned you have found with your students, which is this sense of entitlement that every time you talk about taxing someone for whatever income or whatever they had, they feel that it's almost the same as a robbery. They're taking something that it's really mine, right?
Right.
So I think that's super interesting. The idea that we should think of these forms of taxation, which many economists have argued for that on economic grounds, and you are arguing for them not only on economic grounds, but also for some kind of cultural grounds and the message they convey. So I think if you could elaborate on that, I think that could be very interesting, especially for a country like Colombia, where it is really hard to get people to be happy about paying taxes. No one wants to pay taxes, but we are especially displeased with that. And we especially feel that it is like taking something that it's our own.
Right. Well, thank you for focusing on this theme about what I would call the expressive significance of taxation, the way in which taxation expresses values that a society makes. I would, since we're now in the area of solutions or alternatives to a competitive, market-driven meritocracy, broadly speaking, just to take a step back, I think we should focus less on arming people for meritocratic competition and focus more on affirming and renewing the dignity of work. Now, by the dignity of work, I don't just mean that everyone should be able to have a job that pays a decent living, though that's very important. But work is not only a way of making a living, it's also a way of contributing to the common good and winning recognition, appreciation, and respect for having done so. And when people are cut off from work, or unable to find work, even if one found a way to provide income support so that they could meet their basic needs, something of human and civic significance would be lost. And that is that everyone feel that they are contributing and actually are contributing to the common good so that they can be honored and recognized as members, as participants, as contributors to the economy and to the common good. Shortly before he was assassinated, Martin Luther King went to speak to a group of striking sanitation workers, garbage collectors in Tennessee. And he said to them, what he said to them struck me. He said, the person who picks up your garbage is, in the final analysis, as important as the physician, because if he doesn't do his job, diseases will be rampant. And then he added, all labor has dignity. And I think this is what he was speaking about. The dignity of work, recognition of one's contribution. And we see this during the pandemic, when those of us, the pandemic revealed and highlighted inequalities that pre-existed the pandemic. The most vivid of them was the divide between those of us who had the luxury of working from home and people who either lost their jobs or who, to perform their jobs, had to expose themselves to risk. And so during the pandemic, those of us who could work from home came to recognize, I think, how deeply we depend on workers we often overlook. Not only the workers in the hospitals, the nurses and the doctors and the nurse assistants, but I'm thinking also of delivery workers, warehouse workers, grocery store clerks, home healthcare providers, childcare workers. These are not the best paid or most honored workers in our societies, but now we began calling them essential workers. So this could be a moment, it could be an opening for a broader public debate about how to bring their pay and recognition into better alignment with the importance of their work. You mentioned the system of taxation that could begin to give expression to the dignity of work. Here's one example. It's striking that in many countries, certainly including the US, we tax earnings from labor at a higher rate than earnings from dividends and capital gains. Why is that? What is the moral and civic justification for that? What is the message we implicitly send that earnings from capital gains and dividends, those activities are more important than providing useful goods and services in the real economy? So this is one question that I think we should reconsider. And another is the tax question that you mentioned, to do with finance. During the age of meritocracy, which has also been the time of neoliberal globalization, the role of finance in advanced economies has become greater and greater, as measured by share of GDP and especially as measured as share of corporate profits. Finance looms very large. And finance is important because it's a way of directing capital to socially useful activities. However, most of the increase in the role of finance in recent decades has not been of the productive kind. Most of it consists of speculative activities quite far removed from the real economy. In fact, one expert on this topic estimated that only about 15% of financial activity in places like the US and Britain involves investing in new productive enterprises. And 85% consists of speculation on the future prices of already existing assets, and very often contrived, invented derivative assets, things like that. So if that's true, then I think we should have a broader debate about what really counts as a valuable contribution to the common good. We have outsourced that moral question to markets. But and so we assume we just assume that the money people make is the measure of their contribution to the common good. But we know this isn't so. Do we really believe that a high-frequency trader makes a contribution that is 800 times more valuable than the contribution of a school teacher or a nurse or a doctor treating COVID patients? Even the most enthusiastic free market advocates are unlikely to say that that's the case. Well, then we should have a public debate about how to design our tax system in a way that reflects these judgments about values. And I suggest in the book, as you mentioned, Leopoldo, that we should perhaps make a trade-off. We should institute a financial transactions tax on speculative financial transactions, and use that money to offset taxes on working people, payroll taxes, for example. So, and this not only in the name of economic efficiency and productivity, though I think that case could also be made, but also for the expressive significance that the tax would have, and the meaning of having a public debate, an explicit debate about whose contributions really matter. What does count as a valuable contribution to the common good? That's the idea.
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, not all economists will agree with me, but I think that most of the most rigorous recent research in economics also shows that taxes that we thought would be super distortive for the function of the economy are not actually as distortive as we think. So that's the case, for instance, for wealth or capital taxation, which was deemed as, very, very inefficient, and you should have zero taxation according to a doctrine. And there are a bunch of economists recently saying, well, actually, that's not true, even on economic grounds. But if on top of that, this brings about the message, I think that makes a powerful case for that. So I think well-designed, of course, you cannot be just, you cannot be completely unrestricted about this. You have to bear in mind the efficiency costs. But well-designed tasks on these issues can actually play the role of reducing inequality, sending the proper message, and even helping for productivity. Now, the other aspect that you mentioned in this intervention several times, as part of what we should do to recognize work, to have the discussion of contributive justice, what is our contribution to society, was the idea of having a public debate of what is of social worth, right?
Right.
But here, I guess, and also I should challenge you a bit so that we don't agree on everything. And I sympathize with the argument, but I also see the following risk. It's very clear that in a market economy, it is hard not to do that step from interpreting what the market pays you as the measure of your social worth. So why wouldn't we slip into that again? How is it that the public debate is going to arise and persist in a way that we don't fall into that again?
Well, there is no guarantee. And I think you make a very important point, Leopoldo, that there is a powerful tendency to slide into that assumption, to slide into the assumption that the money people make is the true measure of their contribution to the common good. And I think it's difficult to put that idea to rest once and for all. So I agree with you about that. But I think the only way of questioning that assumption, of keeping it at least as an open question, is to bring public deliberation, public debate, democratic debate to bear on this question. We rarely debate in public whose contributions really matter most. Around the edges occasionally, as when there are debates, for example, during the pandemic, about whether frontline essential workers should be given certain hazard pay. That would be a small example. What I'm suggesting is a broader, more systematic way of putting this question at the center of political debate, as a way at least of disturbing or questioning our tendency to slide into the equivalence, the false equivalence, I think, between how much money someone makes and how valuable is their contribution to the economy and the common good.
So since you touched on public debate, and since I am an economist, I think it's good to talk about the role of economists, and you are pretty critical of them. And I am pleased that you are, despite being an economist, because I insist a lot of the time on this with my colleagues, on how we not always engage into the public debate productively. And what you criticize in particular is the role, our role of economists around the world in promoting a technocratic view, according to which, faced with the failure to produce true equality of opportunity or a level playing field and so on, we basically must focus on the technical problem of solving market failures, and that's our role, and that's it. And that's an approach that you mentioned kind of influenced politicians like the Clintons and Obama as president, even though perhaps not so much as a candidate. And I think, and I completely agree with this criticism. I don't have anything to add to it. The one thing that I want, that I reflected on by reading your book, is that one reason I think, despite being an economist, I am critical of this view as well, is because my field of expertise is in political economy, meaning the understanding that we must incorporate the incentives and struggles of different social groups when understanding the market, right? When understanding overall prosperity, when understanding how it is distributed among people. But recently, I have come to the realization, and your book helped me on that, that even this falls short, because that is still a technical question. How do you incorporate these agents into your formal analysis, so to speak? But it leaves aside a lot of cultural aspects, for lack of a better word, that are embedded in the social interactions that occur in the market. So with this long introduction, I get to the question, which is that I think you have a lot to say on the cultural implications of meritocracy, on why this kind of cultural issues or how this permeates our culture would be very important, and one would miss the mark by looking only at this as a technical question, as economists sometimes are tempted to do.
Well, I think you've put it beautifully, Leopoldo, and powerfully. And I appreciate the kind of work you do and economists like you do to broaden the conception of what economics is and can contribute, to include dimensions of political economy, and even to explore the, I think, rich terrain where economics meets normative questions. And for too long, I should say, first of all, that your broad conception of economics, which I admire, goes back to that of the classical political economists, from Adam Smith to Marx to John Stuart Mill. They, despite their ideological differences, conceived economics not as an autonomous, value-neutral science, but as continuous with moral and political philosophy. And I think that we should try to find our way to get back to that broad conception of economics as bound up with normative questions. And in recent decades, this is hard to do. So economists like you, Leopoldo, are swimming against a powerful current of convention within economics, which you've described beautifully just now. It's the idea, the faith, and it is a kind of faith, that economics is a value-neutral science of human behavior, that it doesn't need to concern itself with normative questions. I think this is a mistaken conception of economics, but I also think it's had a damaging political consequence. Because insofar as political leaders and political parties have embraced this narrow technocratic view of economics, they've missed something important. And they've encouraged a kind of technocratic way of thinking about the public good as a matter of efficiency, detached from, as they would see it, messy debates about what makes for a just society, about what we owe one another as citizens, and about what should be the role and reach of markets and market mechanisms for that matter. So this idea, this faith in technocratic expertise is closely connected to the faith in meritocracy and to the belief that markets can tell us whose contributions matter most. Clearly, that's a normative question. Because how can we discuss what counts as a valuable contribution to the common good without having a broad debate about competing conceptions of the common good, of the purposes and ends worthy of this or that political community? Clearly, those are normative questions, questions of value. And so the meritocratic conceit has developed, especially in the last 4 decades, alongside the technocratic conceit. And this has narrowed the scope of public discourse. Because if technocratic experts can tell us how to run the economy, then what role is there left for democratic citizens? Where are the questions of values that can be debated by democratic citizens in shaping the direction of public policy, whether it's tax policy or trade policy or whatever the case may be? So the technocratic way of thinking about the public good, that has been very damaging. And I think it's contributed to the force of the so-called populist backlash against experts. Because we see that the backlash against meritocracy and against credentialed experts is a kind of anguished response to the way in which technocracy has narrowed the scope of democratic public debate. So really to address that problem, in addition to what we've discussed about affirming the dignity of work and seeking a morally more robust kind of public discourse, we also have a lot of work to do in exactly your field, your domain, Leopoldo, which is to reconceive and broaden the way economics is studied and taught. I think this is an enormously important part of any renewal of democratic public life.
Yeah, I agree. That's what I am working on, at least. And I think you have a very nice sentence towards the conclusion that sort of sums up this, which is that democracy cannot be, something like economics by other means. And I think that sums up essentially what you're saying about the richness that the public debate should have. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. I guess one reaction when it comes to this is that you also talk about the centrality of incentives in public discourse, and in particular the discourse of economists, because it tends to focus on the sort of technocratic aspect of we just have to set the incentives right and we take preferences as given, whereas part of public deliberation should be about what are our preferences. Now, when I was reading that, I thought also you give importance to the role of deliberation and persuasion, which sounds very good. But I thought of the following that perhaps some people might argue, which is incentives at the least protect or respect people's agency. And there's a risk, especially in less democratic countries, that persuasion easily slips into propaganda. What do you think about that risk and those trade-offs, especially in some settings?
That is a risk, I agree, especially in an age of demagogues, as we've seen, that persuasion can degenerate into the kind of demagogic appeal to anger and resentment and grievance, rather than to be a kind of reasoned public discourse. But I don't think that this tendency, the danger that persuasion can be corrupted into demagoguery, should argue for relying on incentives rather than persuasion. But we have, I think the balance of incentives and persuasion may vary case to case. We have an interesting example of this right now, and I think it's going to become a growing debate in many countries. Thinking about vaccines. In rich countries that have lots of vaccines available, the problem now is not access to vaccines. The United States has hit a kind of ceiling. About roughly 60% of those eligible have gotten a vaccine, but the others have not. And we're having another surge of the coronavirus, not because we lack vaccines. I think we should do more to share vaccines with the rest of the world, but that's a further issue. It's that people are hesitant or skeptical or don't want to be vaccinated. And so the question is, some places, some states have said, well, there are three ways of trying to deal with this during a pandemic. You can have a vaccine mandate. And in France and Italy, they're coming close to a version of this. That if you want to go into a store or an indoor theater or a place of business, you must be vaccinated, the mandate. Or the American way, provide an incentive. You know, they've provided in some states cash incentives. They've entered people in lotteries. You can enter a lottery to win $1 million. If you get vaccinated, you can get free beer. You can get, in one case, I think they were even giving you a chance to win a free gun in the South if you get vaccinated. A perverse incentive, in my view. So there are incentives to get vaccinated. And then the third way, mandate, incentive, and persuasion. Trying to educate people in the importance of it, trying to address their worries, sometimes legitimate worries, about previous medical experimentation on certain communities that lead those communities to be wary of public health initiatives. So how do we decide? How do we decide to what extent to use a mandate, to what extent to use incentives, to what extent to use persuasion in the case of vaccines? I'm not saying that persuasion alone may always be the right answer, but it's a matter of judgment. And that judgment is something that, well, democratic citizens have to debate. It's a judgment that involves normative questions. It's not the kind of judgment, and this is the main point, that technocratic expertise can deliver, because it involves competing questions of values.
Yeah, the stakes are too high. And maybe when the stakes are this high, you cannot leave everything to the economists, I think. Let me share with you something. I know that we are reaching the end of our conversation, but if I can share with you something about Colombia that I think connects very directly to your work, and then perhaps only we have time to talk about two implications or broader implications of your work. So in terms of Colombia, I've recently been working with a colleague, Mauricio Garcia Villegas, on understanding the Colombian educational context. And one thing that strikes anyone who observes the data in Colombia is that as soon as Colombians become wealthier, they stop receiving their education in public institutions and flee to private institutions in the hopes of, getting a better quality of education. Now, it turns out that if you can pay enough, you actually do get the higher quality of education. But many people actually flee to the private sector, even though the quality of the schools is not superior to that of public institutions. And, that led us to do some follow-up work coming in another book that is going to come up later this year, which explores the cultural reasons for that. And we build on all the ideas on this, but essentially I want to share with you 2 exercises that we did. So first, we came up with an index that tells us how elite sounding are the names of these private schools, how much they sound as schools of the elite. And here's what we found, that the schools that perform better academically are also the schools that have more elite sounding names, that the schools that have more elite sounding names are more expensive even after accounting for how good they are academically, and that the eliteness in the sounds of the names of the schools is particularly pronounced in municipalities that are more unequal. So 3 big results on there. And then we did another exercise, which is that we asked job recruiters to look at a series of fictitious candidates to get an internship at a consulting firm. And the job could be a technical job or a technical job with social interactions, with interacting with high-level clients. And what we found is that although the recruiters value the merit of those students who, coming from public schools, are able to get a university education in Colombia, they tend to favor the private school kids when it comes to jobs that require the social interaction. So I'm not going to share with you our interpretation yet. I just wanted to share with you these findings and get your reading of them. How do you interpret this? What do you read from this?
First, I think it's a fascinating study, and I hope I can read it in whatever form you have it, Leopoldo. I learned a lot from it. My impression is that what your findings suggest is the powerful prejudice of credentialism. Now, most prejudices have now been discredited in our society, which is not to say they don't exist, but people don't admit to most prejudices easily. But credentialism, that's the last, I would say, the last acceptable prejudice, the last prejudice that operates powerfully and that people are not embarrassed to express or to act upon. And by credentialism, I mean the prejudice of preferring or valorizing institutions or graduates of institutions that seem elite, that seem to reflect merit on the students who graduate from there. It's a spurious merit, as your experiment shows, but the credentialist prejudice is the prejudice characteristic of a meritocratic society. And the fact that the people are relatively unembarrassed about that prejudice by comparison with others suggests the deep hold, I think, that meritocratic assumptions have in the way we think about success. So that would be my take. But do you find that fits what you found?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. That's part of our interpretation. And we also feel that, accessing the private school is essentially not just accessing a high quality of education, it's also accessing social status, this credentialism.
Yes.
And schools know this and they charge for this. And parents are willing to pay for this even beyond the simple academic achievement that they get in these places.
Oh, yeah.
And getting this status pays off more in unequal places, which is troubling because it perpetuates an inequality. In these places, it is important to get this, but who can get this? Whoever gets money, and that perpetuates inequality. And then
if I could...
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, and I was just going to say, and the job internship experiment shows us that in these private schools, kids accumulate something more than knowledge. They accumulate these sort of social assets, tastes, accents, manners of speech, social contacts, and a prestige that can be used to access the better paying jobs and the ones that have more opportunities for advancement. So I think, this connects very closely to your work because it shows us that the usual economist answer, which is improve the quality of public schools, is going to fall short. You can bring quality the quality of public schools to the standard of private schools, and you are not going to solve the problem if people don't get together in the same arena. These social distinctions break away, and you value public schools. So that's the reason I thought this will ring with your contribution in your book, essentially.
It does very much. I would love to read it. And what it brings out, and this may be a good note to kind of end on, is that this is damaging, this tendency, this credentialism, this seeking for the designer label on a education. It's damaging not only for its own sake, and not only because it heightens inequality, but also because, as you suggested when you were setting up the experiment, it leads the affluent to evacuate, to secede from the public realm. And one of the great sources of the polarization that we see in democracies around the world is that the public realm, the public sphere, has become diminished. There are fewer and fewer public places and common spaces where citizens come together, gather, even in the course of their everyday lives, and encounter one another, bump up against one another. And so this erosion of the public sphere, the loss of class mixing institutions, hardens the inequalities and deepens the polarization. So the hope, and I suppose, Leopoldo, we should end on a hopeful note, the hope of this diagnosis is that we need to reconnect economics with normative questions. We need to contend with inequality directly, not just by telling working people, you'll be all right if you go get a college education. We should attend to the dignity of work. And we should do what we can to repair a democratic public sphere, where men and women from different walks of life, different class backgrounds, encounter one another, bump up against one another in the course of their everyday lives, because this is how we learn to negotiate our differences. And this, in the end, is how we come to care for the common good. So I want to thank you not only for this conversation, Leopoldo, but also for your work, for your efforts to broaden the conception of what economics can be. I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate this.
Quite the opposite. I really enjoy your book and this conversation, and I'm looking forward to your next book. I kept thinking as I read this one, what could it be? I think there are natural spin-offs. I, for example, couldn't help but think about those who are left behind and the very strenuous notion of responsibility that merit has. And so you could perhaps talk about how we treat prisoners and criminals in society. I think that's one topic that is not in your book, but really connects to your book. Yeah. You talked about globalization, and there's no biggest difference in luck today than being born in one country or other. So we are globalized except in freedom of movement among people. So this is just to say that apart from the topics that we were able to cover in this hour, there are so many more that emerged from the book that I really thank you. I learned a lot, I thought a lot, and you couldn't ask more from a book than actually, generate all this reflection. So thank you very much. And I hope that the viewers also enjoy not only the talk, but also the book that I hope they buy.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Leopoldo.
No, thank you very much.